Hashi buried his wife at dawn. By sunset, she walked back through his door holding a baby. The shovel hit frozen ground like a hammer against bone, and Jacob Mercer felt every vibration climb through his arms into his chest where his heart was supposed to be. The hole wasn't deep enough yet, but his shoulders screamed, and the sun was coming. He'd promised her a proper burial before the town woke, before the whispers started, before anyone could see what grief had carved into his face. The November wind cut through his wool coat as he worked, sweat mixing with the dust that coated everything in Ashford Creek. 3 days ago, Sarah had been alive, laughing at something he'd said about fixing the fence. 2 days ago, she'd taken ill with a fever so sudden it felt like God's hand had reached down and touched her forehead. Yesterday morning, she'd stopped breathing while he held her hand and begged her not to leave. Now he was digging her grave behind their cabin because the ground at the cemetery was too hard and he couldn't wait for it to thaw. Couldn't wait for the preacher to come back from visiting his sister in Red Bluff. Couldn't stand the thought of her lying in the cold room another hour. The sky turned from black to deep purple as he finished. His hands bled through the calluses, but he barely felt it. He'd wrapped Sarah in her wedding quilt, the one her mother had made, the one with the blue squares that matched her eyes. When he lowered her into the earth, something inside him cracked so loud he thought the whole valley must have heard it. He stood there after covering the grave, his lips moving in a prayer he didn't really believe would reach anyone. The cross he'd hammered together from barn wood looked crooked in the morning light, but Sarah wouldn't have minded. She'd never cared much about things being perfect. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the mound of dirt. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you." The sun broke over the eastern hills as he walked back to the cabin, each step feeling like he was dragging chains. He'd have to face the empty rooms now, the silence that would press against him like a physical weight. He'd have to figure out how to keep breathing when every breath felt like betrayal. Inside, he collapsed into the chair by the cold stove and stared at nothing. Hours passed maybe. The light changed from morning gold to afternoon white. He should eat something, should check on the horses, should do any of the 1,000 things that life on a frontier ranch demanded. Instead, he sat and watched dust particles float through the air and thought about how Sarah used to hum while she cooked. When the knock came at the door near sunset, he almost didn't answer. Probably someone from town who'd heard, coming to offer condolences he didn't want. Mrs. Fletcher, maybe, with one of her casseroles and that look of pity that made him want to put his fist through a wall. The knock came again, softer this time. He stood and crossed to the door, his legs stiff from sitting so long. When he pulled it open, the words he'd prepared died in his throat. Sarah stood on his porch. Not a ghost, not a vision conjured by his shattered mind. Sarah, solid and real, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and her blue eyes bright with something he couldn't name. She wore the same dress she'd died in, though it looked cleaner somehow, less wrinkled. And in her arms, wrapped in a blanket he'd never seen before, was a baby. Jacob's hand found the doorframe to keep himself upright. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The world tilted sideways, and he wondered if he'd finally lost his mind completely. "Jacob," Sarah said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, warm and a little rough at the edges, like she'd just woken from sleep. "I know this don't make sense. I know what you must be thinking." "You're dead," the words scraped out of him. "I buried you this morning. I felt you stop breathing. You were cold," and he couldn't finish. Couldn't reconcile the woman in front of him with the still, pale figure he'd wrapped in that quilt. "Can I come in?" she asked. "Please, it's getting dark and the baby needs to be warm." He stepped back mechanically, his brain struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. Sarah walked past him into the cabin, moving with that familiar grace she'd always had. She went straight to the chair by the stove and sat down, adjusting the baby in her arms. Jacob closed the door and turned to face her, his back pressed against the wood like he might need it to hold him up. "What's happening right now? Is this hell? Did I die too and just don't know it?" Sarah looked up at him and something flickered across her face. Sadness, maybe, or guilt. "You're not dead, neither am I, not anymore." "Not anymore," he repeated numbly. "Sarah, I held your body. You weren't breathing. Your skin was cold as ice. I wrapped you up and dug a hole in frozen ground and put you in it because you were dead." "I was," she said quietly. "For a little while I think I was." The baby made a small sound, and she looked down at it with an expression Jacob had never seen on her face before. Tender, yes, but also protective in a way that seemed almost fierce. "Whose child is that?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Sarah's eyes met his again. "Mine, ours, if you'll have her." "Ours," the word felt strange in his mouth. "Sarah, we weren't expecting a baby. You never told me you were pregnant, and even if you were, you couldn't have given birth after." He stopped, the logic of it all crumbling in his hands. "None of this makes sense." "I know." She shifted the baby slightly, and Jacob caught a glimpse of a tiny face, eyes closed, impossibly small fingers curled against a blanket. "But she's here now, and she needs us. She needs you." Jacob ran both hands through his hair, pulling hard enough to hurt. "I need you to explain, right now, what happened. Where did you go? Where did that baby come from?" Sarah stood up carefully, cradling the infant against her chest. She walked to the window and stared out at the darkening sky. When she spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear it. "When the fever took me, I felt myself leaving. It was like falling through water, only warmer, quieter. There was a light ahead and I wanted to go to it so bad, Jacob. I wanted to rest." She paused, her breath fogging the glass. "But then I heard crying. A baby, crying like her heart was breaking, and I couldn't go toward the light because that sound was pulling me the other direction." Jacob listened, his throat tight. Part of him wanted to call her crazy, wanted to shake her and demand real answers. But the larger part, the part that had loved her since he was 17 years old, needed to hear whatever she had to say. "I followed the sound," Sarah continued, "through darkness so thick I couldn't see my own hands. And then I was in a place I didn't recognize. A cabin, but not ours, smaller, dirtier. And there was a woman lying on a bed, bleeding out. She'd just given birth, but something went wrong. There was too much blood, and the baby was crying, and there was nobody else there to help." She turned from the window to face him, tears running down her cheeks. "The woman looked at me, Jacob, right at me, even though I don't think I was really there, not the way you and I are here now, and she said, 'Please, take her, don't let her die alone.'" Jacob's legs gave out, and he sank onto the bench by the door. "Who was she?" "I don't know, never seen her before, but I picked up that baby and I held her, and the woman smiled and closed her eyes, and that was that. She was gone. And I was holding this child, and suddenly I could feel my own body again, could feel breath in my lungs and my heart beating. It was like whatever brought me to that place gave me a choice. I could keep walking toward the light, or I could come back and bring the baby with me." "So you came back," Jacob said hoarsely. "So I came back." Sarah looked down at the infant in her arms. "I don't know how I got from that cabin to here. One moment I was there, the next I was walking up our road with her in my arms. But Jacob, I couldn't leave her. I couldn't let her die in that place with nobody to love her. And I couldn't leave you either, not if I had a choice." The silence that followed stretched out long and heavy. Jacob stared at his wife, at the baby she held, and tried to make any of it fit into the world he understood. It didn't, couldn't, but here she was anyway, breathing and warm and real enough to touch. "The town's going to lose their minds," he finally said. "They're going to say you're a ghost or a demon or I don't know what. Mrs. Fletcher saw you die, Sarah. Dr. Robbins confirmed it. Half the women in Ashford Creek probably know by now." "I know." Sarah's voice was steady, but he could see the fear in her eyes. "We could leave, take the baby and go somewhere nobody knows us, start over." Jacob stood and walked to her slowly, like approaching a wild horse that might spook. When he reached her, he lifted one hand and touched her face, half expecting his fingers to pass through her like smoke. But her skin was warm and solid, her cheek fitting into his palm the way it always had. "Is it really you?" he whispered. "It's really me." He pulled her against him then, careful of the baby between them, and buried his face in her hair. She smelled like dust and wood smoke and something else he couldn't name, but underneath it all was the scent that was purely her. His shoulders shook, and he realized he was crying, great heaving sobs that he'd been holding back since she'd stopped breathing in his arms. "I thought I lost you," he managed. "I thought I'd have to spend the rest of my life without you." "I'm here," she murmured against his chest. "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." They stood like that until the baby started fussing, small mewling sounds that turned into genuine cries. Sarah pulled back and adjusted the blanket. "She's hungry, we'll need milk, and I don't have any yet. My body's still figuring out what it's supposed to be doing." Jacob wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "Mrs. Fletcher has a goat. She might have some milk we could use until—" He stopped, the practicalities of the situation suddenly overwhelming. "Sarah, what are we going to tell people?" She met his gaze squarely. "The truth. They'll never believe it." "Then they won't believe it. But I'm not going to lie about what happened, and I'm not going to hide. This baby needs us, Jacob. She needs a home and parents who'll love her. I came back for her as much as for you, maybe more, and if the people in town can't accept that, then we'll deal with it however we have to." The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent. Jacob looked at the tiny, red face and felt something shift in his chest. Fear, maybe, or responsibility, or something closer to love than he'd expected to feel for a child that wasn't his by any natural measure. "All right," he said. "All right, let me go get some milk. You stay here and keep the doors locked. I'll be back as quick as I can." "Jacob," Sarah caught his arm before he could turn away. "Thank you for believing me, for not throwing us out." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, gentle and brief. "I'd believe you if you told me the sun rose in the west, Sarah Mercer, always have." The ride into town took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Jacob's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer, fears he couldn't name. When he reached the Fletcher house, he tied his horse quickly and knocked hard on the door. Mrs. Fletcher opened it with flour on her hands and surprise on her face. "Jacob, what are you doing here? I was going to come by tomorrow to check on you, bring you some food. I heard about Sarah, and I'm so terribly—" "I need goat's milk," he interrupted. "As much as you can spare, right now." She blinked at him. "Goat's milk? Jacob, you look half wild. What's going on?" "Please, Mrs. Fletcher, I'll explain later, but right now I just need the milk." Something in his voice must have convinced her because she nodded slowly. "Let me get you a jar. You stay right here." She disappeared into the house and returned a few minutes later with a large mason jar filled with white liquid. "This is all I have that's fresh. You'll need to warm it before you drink it, and—" "It's not for me." Jacob took the jar and pressed 2 coins into her hand, more than the milk was worth. "Thank you, I have to go." "Jacob, wait." But he was already back on his horse, spurring it toward home. Behind him, he could hear Mrs. Fletcher calling his name, confusion and concern mixing in her voice. Let her wonder. Let everyone wonder. He'd deal with the consequences later. When he burst through the cabin door, Sarah was packing with the baby, trying to soothe her with soft words and gentle rocking. She looked up when he entered, relief flooding her features. "You got it." "I got it." He set the jar on the table and went to build up the fire in the stove. "We'll need to warm it and figure out how to feed her without a proper bottle." Sarah nodded. "I can use a piece of clean cloth. My mother did that once when my baby brother couldn't nurse right." They worked together in silence, warming the milk and testing it on Jacob's wrist the way Sarah instructed. When it was ready, she dipped a corner of a clean cloth into it and let the baby suck on it, coaxing her to take the milk drop by drop. Jacob watched them in the lamplight, this impossible scene that somehow felt more real than anything he'd experienced in days. His wife who'd died and come back, a baby with no name and no family except them, a future that made no sense but spread out ahead of them anyway. "What should we call her?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked up from the baby, her eyes shining. "I was thinking Grace, for the grace that brought us all together." "Grace," Jacob repeated. The name settled over him like a blessing. "Grace Mercer." "Grace Mercer," Sarah agreed, smiling for the first time since she'd walked through the door. The baby finished eating and fell asleep against Sarah's chest, milk-drunk and peaceful. Jacob pulled the rocking chair closer to the fire and Sarah sank into it gratefully, exhaustion evident in the lines of her face. You should sleep, he said. I'll watch her. I'm afraid to close my eyes, Sarah admitted. What if I wake up and this was all a dream? What if I'm still in that dark place and none of this is real? Jacob knelt beside the chair and took her free hand in both of his. Then we'll both dream it together. But Sarah, I can feel you. I can see you breathing. You're as real as anything I've ever known. She squeezed his fingers. What are we going to do when people find out? I don't know, he said honestly, but we'll figure it out. We always have. The next morning came too soon. Jacob woke from an uneasy sleep on the floor near the rocking chair to find Sarah already up, changing Grace's makeshift diaper with strips torn from an old sheet. The sight of her moving around the cabin, alive and purposeful, made his chest tight all over again. I need to go dig up that grave, he said, his voice rough from sleep, before someone comes looking and finds it. Sarah's hands stilled. Will they believe us that it was all a mistake? No, Jacob stood and stretched, his back protesting. But I can't leave you buried out there when you're standing right here. We'll deal with whatever comes. He spent the morning undoing what he'd done at dawn the day before, shoveling dirt out of the grave he'd dug with bleeding hands. The quilt was still there, wrapped around nothing now, empty as a shed snakeskin. He carried it back to the cabin and found Sarah crying over it, her fingers tracing the blue squares. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm sorry you had to go through that. Sorry I put you through that. You didn't choose it, he said. Whatever happened, you didn't choose to die any more than you chose to come back. The knock at the door came just after noon. Jacob answered it to find Dr. Robbins on the porch, his medical bag in hand and his face stern. Mrs. Fletcher said you came by last night acting strange, asking for milk, said you looked half out of your mind with grief. The doctor's eyes were kind but concerned. I came to check on you, Jacob, make sure you're all right. I'm fine, Jacob said, not moving from the doorway. Are you? Because grief can do strange things to a man's mind. Make him see things, hear things. Mrs. Fletcher is worried you might hurt yourself. I'm not going to hurt myself. Dr. Robbins studied him for a long moment. Let me come in, Jacob, just to talk, that's all. Jacob hesitated, then stepped aside. The doctor walked into the cabin and stopped dead when he saw Sarah sitting in the rocking chair with Grace in her arms. The color drained from his face. What in God's name? Hello, Dr. Robbins, Sarah said calmly. I know this must be a shock. The doctor's bag hit the floor. He stumbled backward until he hit the wall, his eyes wide and his breath coming in short gasps. You're dead. I checked your pulse myself. There was nothing. Your heart wasn't beating. I was, Sarah agreed. For a little while I was dead, but I'm not anymore. Dr. Robbins looked at Jacob with something close to horror. What have you done? What kind of devil's work is this? Nothing like that, Jacob said sharply. I buried her yesterday morning, and she walked back here at sunset with this baby. I don't understand it any more than you do, but she's here and she's real, and you can check her pulse your damn self if you don't believe me. The doctor didn't move. He just stared at Sarah like she was a rattlesnake coiled on the floor. This isn't possible. People don't just come back from the dead. Well, I did, Sarah said, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your voice down. You're scaring the baby. Dr. Robbins looked at Grace for the first time, really looked at her, and some of the fear in his face shifted to confusion. Where did that child come from? That's a long story, Sarah said. Then you'd better start telling it. So they did. Sarah explained everything while Dr. Robbins listened with the expression of a man watching his understanding of the world crumble. When she finished, he sat down heavily on the bench and rubbed his face with both hands. I should examine you, he finally said. Make sure you're actually alive and not some kind of I don't even know what. Sarah nodded and let him check her pulse, listen to her heart, look in her eyes. He worked in silence, his hands shaking slightly. When he finished, he stepped back and shook his head slowly. You're alive. I can't explain it, but you're alive. Heart beating strong, lungs clear, pupils responding normally. It's like you were never sick at all. So you believe us? Jacob asked. I believe what I can see and measure, Dr. Robbins said carefully. Beyond that, I don't know what to believe. But if this gets out, Jacob, you know what's going to happen. People in this town are God-fearing and superstitious in equal measure. They'll think Sarah's possessed or that you made some kind of deal with the devil. They might run you out or worse. So what do we do? Sarah asked. The doctor was quiet for a long moment. You could tell them Sarah never actually died, that I made a mistake in my examination, that she was just very sick and seemed dead but recovered. Would they believe that? Jacob asked. Some would, the ones who want to believe it. The rest, Dr. Robbins trailed off, the rest will make up their own stories no matter what you say. Sarah looked down at Grace, who slept peacefully in her arms. We are keeping her, no matter what anyone says or thinks. She's ours now. Dr. Robbins nodded slowly. Then I'd suggest you prepare yourselves for whatever comes next, because people will talk, and some of that talk won't be kind. He left a few minutes later, promising to tell Mrs. Fletcher that he'd made an error in his initial assessment, that Sarah had been gravely ill but not actually dead. Whether anyone would believe him remained to be seen. The days that followed were strange and tense. Word spread through Ashford Creek like wildfire. Sarah Mercer hadn't died after all, just been very sick, and now there was a baby at their cabin that no one could quite explain. Some folks came by with gifts and congratulations, choosing to accept the official story. Others stayed away, whispering among themselves about unnatural things and evil spirits. Jacob found himself watching Sarah constantly, half afraid she'd vanish like morning mist. But she stayed solid and real, caring for Grace with a dedication that bordered on fierce. She seemed different somehow, changed by whatever she'd experienced. Quieter, more thoughtful, like she'd seen something beyond the veil that the rest of them couldn't imagine. One evening, about a week after her return, they sat together on the porch while Grace slept inside. The November air had turned bitter cold, but they bundled in blankets and watched the stars emerge one by one. Do you regret it? Jacob asked, coming back instead of going toward that light. Sarah was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then she said, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd kept walking, if there would have been peace there or rest or whatever comes next. But then I look at Grace, or I feel your hand in mine, and I know I made the right choice, even if it's hard, even if people look at us strange now. I'm glad you came back, Jacob said. I don't care if I'm selfish for saying it. I'm glad. She leaned her head against his shoulder. Me too. They sat like that until the cold drove them inside, and Jacob thought about Grace in all its forms. The Grace that had brought his wife back from death. The Grace of a second chance. The Grace of a baby girl who needed them. The Grace of love that persisted even when logic said it shouldn't. Inside the cabin, Grace started to cry, and Sarah went to her immediately, lifting her with practiced ease. Jacob watched them in the firelight, his strange little family, and felt something settle in his chest. Not peace exactly, not yet, but something close enough. Whatever judgment the town passed, whatever stories people told, they'd face it together. Sarah had walked back through their door holding a baby when she should have been cold in the ground, and that was miracle enough to last him the rest of his life. Outside, the November wind howled through the valley, but inside they were warm and together and alive. And that, Jacob thought, was all that really mattered in the end.